everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, and this episode is European Lagers Taste Test. Now, over the past 2 seasons, we have tasted a variety of lagers from different European countries. 6 sovereign nations, in fact: Germany, the Czech Republic, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Ireland. And those 6 nations have fielded a total of 13 different lagers, all of which I will be trying in this episode. So let's get to tasting. Now, to start things off, I think it makes sense to open with a pretty ubiquitous global classic, Heineken. It just makes sense to start with something that really is the most basic form, in many ways, of internationally recognized European lager. Yep, and as I've said in the Heineken episode way back in season 1, this tastes like beer. This is carbonated, slightly hoppy, very, very slightly hoppy, a little malty, very non-offensive, grain-based alcohol of around sort of 4.5%, 5% ABV. It is the most standard in many ways of what you would associate with just a table beer, a table lager. And I think let's open with this one so we can see how the other ones stack up in comparison. It's kind of what you see is what you get. I'm sure virtually all of you have had a Heineken. Let's go with another classic lager beer, Budweiser Budvar, otherwise known as Czech Var if you're in the United States and select other countries. Yes, and that is definitely better than Heineken. This is what's sort of interesting, and I was reading about this kind of the other day, was Heineken is sometimes classified in a category that exists nowadays called sort of, I believe it's just European lager. It's sort of this blanket kind of umbrella term characterizing very sort of middle of the road, non-offensive, 4 to 5% kind of ABV, typical beers. And even just comparing something like the Czech Var, Budweiser Budvar to the Heineken, it's very clear how much more crisp and dry and slightly hoppy this beer is compared to the Heineken. It's got much more character to it as a lager that you'd think normally, well, these must just be very generic beers, right? They taste the same. No, they don't. They don't taste the same. And the Budweiser Budvar is a lot more, it's a lot more crisp. And I would say it's a lot more clean on the palate. Next we have Birra Moretti. It's going above here too. What I really like about this beer is it's got the crispness and it's got the really clean feeling of a good pale lager, but the dryness, I think, compared to even the Czech Var, Budweiser Budvar, is just balanced a little bit better with the other parts of the beer. It's just, this is so refreshing to drink. This is very nice, but there's definitely the dryness is what it leads with. This, you have some dryness, but it's a little bit, I think, better worked in. And in some ways it feels lighter, and this might be a weird thing to say, but it's almost as if perhaps maybe the water, it tastes even cleaner and even more refreshing, and just like you're drinking beer, but it's made with such clean spring water that it's just a very, very enjoyable, it's just a very enjoyable drinking experience. I really like Birra Moretti. How about Beck's? From the city of Bremen. Founded, if I remember correctly, the same year actually as Heineken, 1873. And one of the earlier beers to pioneer the idea of a green beer bottle. So, I'm gonna put this right here. Very similar to a Heineken. The only difference really is that a Beck's is slightly, it's a little more oaky. There's a little bit more of a sort of dry, kind of woody flavor to it. and not even so much hoppy. It's not dry in that sense. It's like oaky, but it's very similar to a Heineken. It's just, you know, if you prefer your beer a little bit on the drier side, you know, you prefer the Becks. If you prefer your beer to be a little bit more just sort of all around standard beer, you know, you'd prefer a Heineken. Compared to these two, though, this is definitely further down on the list. It's fine, but it's nothing to write home about in comparison to the competition. So we have Italy, Czech Republic, Netherlands, Germany on the table. Why not mix it up a little bit and go with Ireland? Harp. So this is, as I mentioned, kind of the beer that, so lager, at least historically, isn't really from the British Isles. So Harp, basically created by the Guinness Corporation in the 1960s, was from the start designed as a lager to sort of compete against the likes of, well, you know, stuff like Heineken and Budweiser, Budvar. So let's see how it stacks up. It's going kind of here. It's acceptable. It's acceptable. It has what I'd almost describe as fresh yet slightly tart flavor compared to it. It's certainly a unique enough flavor combination compared to everything else on the table. But what's bringing it down for me is the fact that the body feels very thin. I hate to use the term watery, because watery I usually associate with, you know, like the light beers and the, you know, Bud Lights and Budweisers and, you know, stuff. Not this Budweiser, Budvar, but like American Budweiser, right? So I don't want to use that term. Like, it still has sort of the acceptable level of form to it that one would associate with a lager beer, but it's definitely on the lower end. We are approaching the halfway point. We have Germany, Netherlands, Ireland, Czech Republic, and Italy on the table. What we don't have, though, is Belgium. Stella Artois, another, I'd say along with these two, classic, internationally recognized beer. Really, I'd say up there with the Heineken in terms of what would people most easily sort of recognize as kind of classic table lager. You know, this is all three of these, the big ones, they're all kind of going down here. I would say that sort of, you know, a Stella tastes kind of like a Heineken tastes kind of like a Stella. I think comparing the two of these together, the Stella has a little bit weaker of a body, I think, compared to the Heineken. The Heineken, there's just a touch bit more substance to it. Really, the Stella, I think, is in some ways almost kind of similar to the Beck's in its body, but it doesn't have the oakiness that the Beck's does. So it's more just, it's a slightly weaker bodied beer, but just a little bit more on the malty side, but very, very, very generic, very standard, and sort of non-offensive. You know, one of the selling points in some ways, right, of these beers, I mean, all of them, but really these down here, is that they're very standard, they're not offensive, and they're easy to drink. So we have our first Czech dark beer, Rebel. This is from the Havlíčkův Hrad. So more maltiness, definitely less in the way of hops. Similar body really to these beers towards the upper end, but there's just a little bit of that kind of roasted malt flavor to it that you don't get with the pale lagers, and it's quite nice. But this is definitely a solid beer, and it's got, you know, perfectly fine body, lager style body. There's sort of, you know, a certain acceptable weight to it. It doesn't feel watery or thin or anything like that. It's more on that sort of roasted malt side rather than kind of hoppy, pale, you know, Pilsner side of things. Overall, quite a good beer, very easily drinkable. We have a bunch of Czech beers to get through. Let's do another Czech beer. Let's do the classic Pilsner Urquell. The company that started it all, the brewery that invented the Pilsner, which subsequently took over planet Earth. at least in the world of beer. Yep, and there is that seriously hoppy Pilsner Urquell. And that thing is, as I said in the episode, that thing is a hop, skip, and a jump away from the lager version of an IPA. There's much more going on in this beer than any of these down here. It's really leading with those hoppy notes, and these are hoppy notes. This isn't just, okay, the beer has a little bit of dryness to it, which is sort of how I've described these. This is hoppiness, very much. That's really coming forward in the palate, and that's upon a very, very solid sort of lager base, right? So the maltiness is, I mean, basically I can't really taste it. It's just sort of creating sort of the structure in the beer, right? You sort of, the malt just gives it sort of that body, but flavor-wise, very strong hops, a little bit of floralness to it, floral kind of notes. That's where this is. Let's go with something German. Our second dark lager of the episode, Hofbrau or Hofbräu Dunkel. So again, this is a lager, but it is a dark lager. So that classifies it as a beer worthy of competition in this episode. That's gonna be close. It's very nice too. Put that over here. I might need to do a taste test on the two of these. I really like the malty notes on this. The difference is the Rebel, the maltiness is more, there's more of a roasted maltiness to it. This is not as roasted. It's malty, but it's a very sort of kind of, it's a little softer. There's not that edge to the roast. You know, it's almost like with coffee, right? Sort of, you can have coffee where there's that really kind of dark, kind of almost bitter edge to it. The Rebel Dark, Rebel Cherny, has more of that sort of, you know, not a lot, but a little bit of that kind of roasted edge to the malt. The Hofbrau Dunkel doesn't have that. It's a lot more soft, and it's a bit more understated, but in both of them, the bodies are quite good. And again, these are you know, darker lagers or black lagers, so they're not really going to lead with the hoppiness in nearly the same way. It's going to be much more sort of malt forward. Interestingly, neither of them I would say are particularly sweet. They're just not as hoppy, but just in terms of their quality, I think they're overall quite good. And nothing so far on the table yet that I would describe it as an absolute pass, just a don't even bother. Let's continue on, shall we? We have a few more to go. Praha or Praga. Yep, so this is going right here. It is really, in a way, just based on these three, there's already something of a continuum that exists here, where if you want a very, very hoppy Pilsner style lager, go with this one. If you want a kind of hoppy Pilsner style lager, it's not the only note there, but it's definitely the one that leads the most, you've got Praha. And if you want a, I would say, mostly balanced, slightly hoppy, maybe a little dry lager, Budweiser Budvar / Jack Var. But yeah, perfectly fine, good solid Czech Pilsner beer. Third from last is going to be Rebel Original. It's going somewhere around here. I think on the continuum of Czech Pilsners, this one is hoppier than this one, but there's something about the overall feel of this one that I enjoy more than the Praha, and certainly I think it's a little bit better balanced than the Pilsner Urquell. It's interesting to see actually how all of the Czech beers are really sort of, they're coalescing in like the middle of the table, and they're all very close together actually. We've done a few Czech beers in a row. Let's do another German. Hofbräu Original. This is, I think, going to come down to personal taste, which is, do you prefer your beers slightly on the hoppy side, or do you prefer them more on the balanced malty side? But I gotta say, I quite enjoy the Hofbräu, but I still am having a hard time. You know, I'm gonna break that one up there, just so we have a little bit of a gap. Like with the Budweiser Czechvar, the Hofbräu Original has some dryness to it and a little bit of hoppiness, but it's not as intense as these right here. It's got a good body as well. It's not sweet at all. Very crisp, very clean. It's quite dry, but it's not dry in a overly hoppy sense. It's sort of dry. It's a stronger version of the dryness that I associate with the Moretti, where it's dry, it's very crisp and clean and refreshing, but when you finish drinking it, it doesn't linger in your palate to quite the same degree. There's a little bit of a dryness, but it's not as strong as really the hoppiness that I would associate with the sort of the core section of Czech Pilsners in this area. But I also do want to group these accordingly to the fact that this is more of a personal preference. This is not a beer quality issue. So all of these are good quality beers. It's more just, what do you prefer? The 13th beer is Praha Dark Lager. It is somewhere in here. These are close. These are close together, but there's somewhere in here. The body on it is fine. I don't think it's not quite as good as the body on these kind of from here up, but I do generally like the balance of flavors in it more than, you know, sort of Pilsner, Kel, and of course down. And I'm gonna maybe amend my earlier assessment of the Praha beers. They're certainly solid, but the difference may actually just come down to, do you prefer light or dark? This beer has, in just the most subtle, soft, barely imperceptible sense of the word, an ever so slight, almost ephemeral essence of something that is fruit related, but it is so soft and it is so at the back of the flavors that it's hardly there, but there's something there. These might get moved around depending on sort of a second round of assessment, but as best I can figure, at least in macro categories, this is sort of what we have. Okay, so I have thought about this. I've broken up the rank ordering a little bit as best I can, and my assessment is as follows. In last place, or rather in the lowest category, is Beck's, Stella, and Heineken. While none of these are in the hard pass category, or I could even say maybe soft pass category, none of them are particularly exemplary, but they are very ubiquitous beers and they're very non-controversial. Harp is in this sort of lower middle category where it is slightly more unique and it has a little bit more character than these three, but it has a fairly thin body. The character is kind of just a little tart and slightly bright, but it's not outside of the realm of a lager that is particularly exemplary. This is, I think, really where we start getting into the beers that are good to superior. So Pilsner Urquell is very much a beer that if you really like your hops, you like hoppy Pilsner Czech beers with, I would say, some floral elements to the hops, then Pilsner Urquell is for you. So going on from that is pretty much the beers that I think are in many ways just the most middle of the pack. Praga or Praha. You've got Praha Dark and Praha Pils. So the Praha Dark is perfectly fine. It is a dark lager. It has a very, very, very slight, almost sort of effervescent phantom fruit essence to it that is so slight it's almost imperceptible, but it is there. The Praha Pils is, in the scheme of the Czech Pilsners here, a mix of some hoppy dryness with a little bit of malt. I would say it's maybe about 2/3 hoppy dryness, maybe 1/3 malt. Definitely more balanced than this one. The Rebel beers are both quite good. They're a little bit more dry and bitter in both cases. The Rebel Pils is definitely quite sharp and crisp. It's got a medium body, and the general flavor profile I think is a little bit better than this. It's brewed just slightly better, but it is definitely in a very similar category to this one. And then the Rebel Dark, or the Cherny, what I like about this is it has a little bit of that kind of bitter roasted flavor in the sort of the malt profile compared to the other two dark beers. So this is the one that's going to have the sharpest kind of edge to it. I really like the Hofbräu Original. It's just a classic kind of Bavarian lager. It's not quite a Czech Pilsner really, but it's going to have a bit more, I think, balance in the way of malt, hops, the water used, and sort of the flavor of the barley, the Hofbräu Dunkel. I really like out of the three dark beers. I think it's just the nicest blend of some maltiness, good body, a little bit of dryness, a little bit of hops, but it's not particularly too bitter or too strong. And then in second place, I really have to give it to Budvar Czech var. The thing about this beer is, I can only describe it thusly. If you took something like Heineken and you just made it better in all senses of the word, and you put a bit of that sort of Czech Pilsner dry, hoppy bitterness into it, but not too much. You kept a very nice balance of the malt and the water and the hops, and it just gave you this excellent, clean, refreshing, crisp experience of drinking a classic beer. That is what this is. This is just excellent classic beer. And then finally, in first place, I have to give it to Moretti. It's like if you took water from almost like a glacier or something, and you used that to make your beer, and you combined it with the light sort of straw essence of the Hofbräu Original, but you also took some hoppiness, a little bit of dryness, but not too much from something like the Budvar Czech var. And you also had a little bit of maltiness as well. So it's not too dry and it's not too hoppy and bitter. It's just an excellently blended drink. So for that reason, I've got to give it first place. It's just such an enjoyable beer to have. Yeah, that's my assessment. Let me know what you think in the comments. If I'm totally off the mark, if this is kind of accurate, if you would rank it a little differently, and I will see you in the next episode.